Discordant notes the Winter Melody Concert Hall hummed with exclusive energy, as champagne flutes clinked and diamonds caught the light. Nora stood in the wings, watching the current performer, renowned cellist whose recordings she'd studied. For years, received thunderous applause. Her palms grew damp around her violin case. 5 minutes, Ms. Winters, a stagehand whispered, barely sparing her a glance. Nearby, a group of patrons spoke loudly enough for her to hear. Who is this Winters? Woman? Never heard of her, said a man in a tailored tuxedo. Some last-minute addition. Apparently Reed insisted, replied his companion with a dismissive wave. Probably another of his charitable projects. Remember when he brought that refugee choir last year? Nora's cheeks burned. She opened her violin case, running her fingers along the smooth wood of her instrument, her father's final gift before the car accident that took him. It wasn't a Stradivarius or Guarneri, like those played by tonight's other performers, but its voice was true. You don't belong here, whispered her doubts. Yet something else whispered back, but your music does. When the stage manager finally gestured for her, Nora walked into blinding lights. The audience's polite applause felt perfunctory. Several patrons checked their phones. Others whispered behind program booklets. In the front row, Vivian Reed's expression was one of barely concealed impatience. Nora positioned her violin and began to play. She had chosen Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, a piece that began with a haunting melody that seemed to ask a question of the universe. The first notes wavered slightly, betraying her nerves, but by the 8th measure, the music had taken over. Her bow danced across strings with increasing confidence, her body swaying with emotion that transformed her from the invisible woman they had dismissed into something luminous. Still, most eyes remained disinterested. A woman in the 3rd row yawned ostentatiously. 2 critics in the 5th row exchanged skeptical glances. The message was clear. We're enduring this because we must. Halfway through her performance, the doors at the back of the hall opened. A tall figure slipped in, causing a ripple of whispers. From the corner of her eye, Nora glimpsed movement as the figure made his way down the center aisle. The whispers grew louder, breaking her concentration. Her finger slipped, creating a jarring note. Heat flooded her face. She closed her eyes, shutting out everything but the music, finding her way back to the heart of the piece. When she reached the cadenza, the most challenging part, where the violin stood. Alone, without orchestral accompaniment, she poured everything into it. Her father's sacrifice, her years of struggle, the dismissal she'd faced tonight. Her violin sang with fierce beauty, defiant and vulnerable all at once. As the final notes resonated through the hall, Nora opened her eyes. The tall figure now stood at the foot of the stage, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Julian Reed, recognizable from countless magazine covers, despite his 3-year absence from public life, was watching her with an expression of absolute recognition. The applause that followed was scattered, quickly fading as people realized Julian had arrived. All attention shifted to him. Nora was once again invisible, standing awkwardly on stage as the event organizer hurried forward to announce Julian's address. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for. The founder of the Winter Melody Foundation, Mr. Julian Reed. Julian didn't move toward the podium. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Nora. Mr. Reed, the organizer prompted nervously, and then Julian did something no one expected. He began to applaud slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, his eyes never leaving Nora's. The sound echoed strangely in the confused silence until, uncertain but unwilling to contradict their host, others joined in. Nora stood frozen, her violin still in hand, as applause built around her not from genuine appreciation but from social obligation. It was perhaps more humiliating than being ignored, as she finally turned to leave the stage. Julian's voice rang out, stopping her in her tracks. "Ms. Winters," he called, his voice carrying through the hall. "Would you mind staying? There's something the audience should know." Invisible Symphony, the envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Cream-colored and impossibly thick, with Nora Winters' name written in elegant calligraphy. For a moment, She thought it had been delivered to the wrong apartment in her aging Brooklyn building. Winter Melody Foundation cordially invites you to perform at our annual charity concert, it read. Her hands trembled slightly. The Winter Melody was the most prestigious musical charity event on the East Coast, attended by wealthy patrons and celebrated musicians alike. Nora glanced at her violin case. Worn at the edges from years of traveling, between subway stations where she played for distracted commuters. At 32, she had long ago accepted that her dream of becoming a renowned violinist had slipped away, replaced by the reality of teaching music to disinterested high school students and performing wherever she could. There must be some mistake, she murmured, searching the envelope for clues. A handwritten note on expensive stationery fell out. Your performance of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto at Washington Square Park last month moved me deeply. The foundation would be honored by your participation. All expenses covered. Please. Call to confirm. The signature was illegible, but the phone number belonged to the Winter Melody Foundation, established by Julian Reed, the enigmatic tech billionaire who had disappeared from public view 3 years ago after selling his cybersecurity company for billions. This can't be real, Nora said to her cat, Mozart, who blinked lazily from his perch on her second-hand couch. But it was. A week later, Nora found herself in a luxury hotel suite with a dress she could never afford hanging in the closet, a midnight blue gown that reminded her of starlit skies. The note accompanying it read simply, "For your performance tonight. Your talent deserves a worthy frame." As she prepared for the evening, memories flooded back of her childhood in rural Pennsylvania, of her father, who had sacrificed everything to buy her first violin, of the scholarship to Juilliard that had seemed like the beginning of everything, and of the devastating accident that had killed her father and derailed her career for years as she recovered both physically and emotionally. The concert hall was magnificent. All gold leaf and crystal, filled with people in designer clothes, who glittered like the chandeliers above. Backstage, other musicians, all famous, all accomplished, nodded politely when introduced, but quickly returned to their conversations that excluded her. "You must be Nora," a voice said, and she turned to find an elegant woman in her 60s. Appraising her, "I'm Vivian Reed, Julian's aunt. He insisted we include you in tonight's program, though I must say it's unusual to feature an unknown musician." The words stung, but Nora smiled politely. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, yes." Well, Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. To be performing last, just before Julian's address. "Don't be nervous, these events are more about the donations than the music." As Vivian walked away, Nora clutched her violin case tighter. She didn't belong here among these people who measured worth in bank accounts and family names. But when she closed her eyes and played, none of that mattered. The music was hers, and for a few minutes tonight, she would make it theirs too, whether they wanted it or not. What she didn't know was that Julian Reed had been watching her from the shadows, and that by morning, her life would never be the same. Recognition crescendo. The concert hall fell into stunned silence as Julian Reed, notoriously private and seldom seen, bounded up the steps to join Nora on stage. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, yet there was something almost boyish in his eagerness. Up close, Nora could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes and the faint scar along his jawline. He was taller than she'd expected, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that somehow seemed at odds with the intensity radiating from him. "I apologize for interrupting," Julian said, his voice amplified by the microphone someone hastily provided. "But I couldn't let this moment pass without proper acknowledgement." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Vivian Reed's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. 13 years ago, Julian continued, I was at the lowest point in my life. My company was failing, my investors were pulling out, and I was seriously considering ending everything. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. This was not the scripted speech about charitable giving they had expected. I was in Central Park, sitting on a bench, contemplating my options, when I heard the most extraordinary music coming from a nearby pavilion. A young woman was playing a violin with such raw emotion that it seemed to speak directly to my soul. Julian turned to Nora, whose heart had begun to race. She was playing this very piece, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. I sat there for hours, listening as she practiced, played, sometimes faltered, and began again. Her persistence, her dedication to perfection, made me reconsider my own path. The memory crystallized for Nora that summer day after her freshman year at Juilliard, practicing in the park because her tiny sublet apartment had paper-thin walls and angry neighbors. She had no idea anyone had been listening, let alone that it had meant something to someone. The next day, I restructured my approach to my company, found new investors, and eventually built what became Reed Cybersecurity. The company's success allowed me to establish this foundation, which has raised over $200 million for music education in underserved communities. Julian smiled at Nora, who stood transfixed, her violin clutched against her chest like a shield. You just witnessed was not merely a performance, but a demonstration of why music matters. This woman, Nora Winters, saved my life with her playing, though she never knew it. And tonight, I had the privilege of hearing her play again, after searching for her for years. He turned to address the now captivated audience. Many of you were too busy checking your phones or thinking about the after-party to truly listen. You missed something extraordinary. But I'm giving you another chance. Julian gestured to the orchestra conductor, who looked startled but quickly recovered. Ms. Winters, would you honor us by playing once more? The Batch Chaconne, perhaps? I remember it was the second piece you played that day in the park. Nora blinked in astonishment, even remembered the second piece. With trembling hands, she raised her violin again. This time, as she began to play Batch's hauntingly beautiful chaconne, the audience was transformed. Every eye was upon her, every ear attuned to the complex emotions flowing from her instrument. Julian stood to the side, his expression one of profound respect and something more, a connection that transcended their brief encounters across time. When she finished, the silence lasted for 3 heartbeats before the hall erupted in genuine, thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes, as if truly seeing and hearing her for the first time. Julian approached her again, taking her hand to raise it in acknowledgement of the ovation. His fingers were warm against hers, and she felt a current of recognition pass between them. Tonight, Julian announced once the applause finally subsided, I'm doubling the Foundation's commitment to music education, and I'm establishing a new fellowship program for overlooked musicians of exceptional talent, the Nora Winters Fellowship. Cameras flashed as Julian continued to hold her hand, and Nora saw Vivian's expression shift from disapproval to calculated interest. The other musicians who had dismissed her earlier now watched with a mixture of surprise and reassessment. But it was the quiet words Julian spoke to her, away from the microphone, that truly changed everything. I've been looking for you for 13 years, he said, his eyes holding hers. I never forgot your music, or the way it made me feel like the world still held beauty worth fighting for. Would you join me for dinner after this? There's so much I want to talk to you about. As they exited the stage together to renewed applause, Nora realized that in a room full of some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the country, she had somehow become the only one that mattered. Harmonious Revelations, the restaurant Julian chose, was not what Nora expected. No Michelin stars or exclusive reservations, but a small Italian place in the village with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. The owner, Giuseppe, greeted Julian with the familiarity of an old friend, leading them to a secluded corner table without fanfare. You come here often? Nora asked, surprised by the humble surroundings after the opulence of the concert hall. Julian smiled, the candlelight softening his features. Every Tuesday for the past 10 years, when I'm in New York, best risotto in the city, and no one bothers me for photographs or investment tips. As Giuseppe brought wine without being asked, apparently Julian's usual Nora studied the man across from her. Despite his billions and influence, there was something unguarded about him here, away from just the spotlight. Why did you search for me? She asked finally. Surely you've heard countless musicians since that day in the park. Julian considered her question, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass. Have you ever experienced a moment of such perfect clarity that it divides your life into before and after? Nora nodded, thinking of the accident that had claimed her father's life. Yes, That day in the park was mine. I was 24, drowning in debt. My first startup imploding. I'd started coding in my parents' garage at 16, dropped out of MIT against their wishes, and promised everyone I'd change the world? He gave a self-deprecating smile. Instead, I was contemplating jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge. Paused as Giuseppe returned with 2 plates of risotto, the steam carrying the aroma of wild mushrooms and truffle. Then I heard your violin. The Mendelssohn first, then the Bach. You played for hours, sometimes stopping to repeat passages until you got them right. Your dedication was ... humbling. Here I was, ready to give up after one failure, while you worked tirelessly to perfect something beautiful. Nora remembered that day preparing for a competition she ultimately hadn't won. I had no idea anyone was listening. That was the beauty of it. You weren't playing for an audience or approval. You were playing for the music itself. Julian leaned forward. It changed everything for me. I went home, coded for 72 hours straight, and created the algorithm that eventually became the foundation of Reed's cybersecurity. You've been looking for me all this time? Why not just enjoy the memory? Julian's expression grew serious, because I wanted to thank you. And because when I established the foundation, I promised myself I would find you and make sure your talent was recognized. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily between them. Julian spoke of his childhood in Seattle with parents who emphasized social responsibility alongside success. Nora shared stories of her father, a high school music teacher who had recognized her talent early and worked 2 jobs to afford her lessons. He died before I got into Juilliard, she said softly. Almost quit playing afterward. The accident injured my wrist, and during recovery, I lost my scholarship. By the time I could play properly again, my moment had passed. Yet you never stopped playing, Julian observed. The music was all I had left of him. After dinner, they walked through Washington Square Park, the night air crisp with early autumn. Street musicians nodded respectfully to Nora. Many knew her from her subway performances. What happened to you? Nora asked, as they paused by the fountain. 3 years ago, you disappeared from public view at the height of your success. Julian was quiet for a moment, his expression reflective. Burnout, the doctors called it. I call it losing my way. The company had grown beyond my control. Board meetings, shareholder demands, endless publicity. The algorithm that started it, all the one your music inspired, was being weaponized. For government surveillance, that wasn't why I created it. So you sold everything and vanished. Yes. I needed to remember why I started. What mattered? His eyes met hers. Tonight, watching you play, I felt it again, that clarity, that purpose. Yes. As they continued walking, their hands brushed accidentally. The contact sent a spark through Nora that had nothing to do with his wealth or newfound recognition of her talent, and everything to do with the genuine connection forming between them. The fellowship you announced, she said. It's generous, but you're wondering if it's just charity because of our connection, Julian finished for her. It's not. Your talent deserves recognition on its own merits. The fellowship will be independently administered. You don't even have to be involved if you don't want to be. The consideration behind his words touched her. And what happens tomorrow? You return to your world. I to mine. Julian stopped walking, turning to face her. That depends on you, Nora. I'd like to see you again, not as a benefactor or because of some cosmic debt I feel I owe you. Simply because talking with you feels like coming home to a place I didn't know I was missing. In the distance, a saxophonist began playing a jazz standard. The melody floated around them, a soundtrack to a moment balanced on the edge of possibility. I'd like that, Nora said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But I need you to understand something. I won't be a curiosity you parade at events, or a project you take on because my story inspires you. My music is who I am, not what I do. Julian's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. I wouldn't want it any other way. As they parted that night, no promises were made beyond meeting for coffee the following week. Yet something fundamental had shifted in both their worlds, a recognition not just of what had been, but of what might be. What neither realized was that a photographer had captured their walk through the park, and by morning speculation about Julian Reed's mysterious violinist would be splashed across social media and tabloids alike. Their private connection was about to become very public indeed. Perfect cadence, the next 3 months unfolded in a whirlwind of contrasts. Nora's subway performances drew crowds now, people holding up phones to record Julian Reed's violinist, much to her dismay. Her high school students suddenly paid rapt attention in class, hoping for glimpses into her relationship with the billionaire. Overnight, her obscurity had transformed into a different kind of invisibility scene, but not for herself. "Ms. Winters, is it true you're engaged to Julian Reed?" asked Tabloid Today when she stepped out of her apartment building. "Did Julian buy you that violin?" demanded Celebrity Scoop when she arrived at school. "Sources say you've moved into Reed's." Penthouse insisted another as she tried to board the subway. She hadn't, of course, despite their growing closeness weekly dinners. Long walks through museums where Julian knew the guards who would let them in after hours. Evenings spent with him working on code while she practiced. Nora had maintained her separate life. Her modest apartment, her teaching position. Julian, for his part, weathered the attention with practiced ease, though he was clearly frustrated by how it affected her. "We could leave New York," he suggested one evening, as they sat on the rooftop garden of his downtown building. The lights of the city spread before them like fallen stars. "I have houses and places where privacy still exists." Nora shook her head, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the back of his hand. "Running away won't solve it. Besides, my life is here, my students, my community performances, the homeless shelter where I volunteer." The shelter had become a point of contention between them. Located in a deteriorating building in a rough neighborhood, it was where Nora had been playing weekly concerts for years. Julian worried about her safety. Nora refused to abandon the people who had appreciated her music when no one else did. "At least let me donate to improve the security there," Julian had argued. "They need basic repairs and food supplies more than security cameras." "Right," Nora countered. Their differences in perspective, his instinct to solve problems with resources, her understanding of needs beyond the material, created a tension that deepened their relationship, even as it occasionally sparked disagreements. The Winter Melody Fellowship, meanwhile, had selected its first 5 recipients, overlooked musicians of exceptional talent who would receive financial support, performance opportunities, and mentorship. Nora had agreed to serve as an artistic advisor, but insisted that Julian create a blind selection process to prevent favoritism. When the foundation announced the fellows at a press conference, Nora stood beside Julian, poised and professional. In a simple blue dress, reporters shouted questions about their relationship, largely ignoring the accomplished musicians being recognized. "This isn't about us," Julian had said firmly. "That is about creating opportunities for artists who deserve recognition." Later that night, after the fellows had been celebrated properly at a dinner where the focus remained on their talents, Julian and Nora walked along the Hudson River, the December air sharp with approaching winter. "You were magnificent today," Julian said. "The way you redirected that reporter who tried to make it about our relationship instead of Tobias's composition for the Paralympic opening ceremony." Nora smiled, remembering how she'd firmly but politely refocused the conversation. "I've learned from watching you handle the press." They stopped at a bench overlooking the water, Julian wrapping his coat around both of them against the chill. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence, "about what you said regarding the shelter, that sometimes the solution isn't what seems obvious to me." "Oh," Nora leaned against his shoulder, listening. "I visited while you were teaching yesterday, just to see it for myself, understand what they're facing." Nora straightened, surprised. "You went to the shelter? Alone?" Julian nodded. "Turns out the director, Denise, has a master's in urban planning, but couldn't find work after her husband became ill. She gave me quite an education about the systemic issues they're dealing with." "That sounds like Denise," Nora said, smiling at the thought of the no-nonsense shelter director lecturing one of the world's wealthiest men. "She helped me understand something important," Julian continued. "The same thing your music taught me years ago and continues to teach me now, The true value isn't always where we expect to find it. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I've spent 3 months trying to figure out how to fit into your world without disrupting it with my ... complications. But watching you today with the fellows, seeing how you've navigated all this attention without losing yourself, I realized something. We've been creating our own world, note by note, day by day. From his pocket, Julian withdrew not a ring box as Nora momentarily feared, but a small, carved wooden object, a tiny violin, exquisitely detailed. My father made this, he explained. It was the last thing he carved before Parkinson's took his dexterity. Like your violin from your father, it reminds me of what matters. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers gently around it. Not proposing, not yet. That would only fuel the media frenzy. But I am asking if you'll consider a partnership beyond what we have now. I'm establishing a new initiative separate from the foundation, a program to rebuild arts education in public schools, nationwide. I want you to lead it, not as Julian Reed's girlfriend, but as Nora Winters, artist and educator. The offer took her breath away. It was everything she cared about, packaged with the resources to make real change. The position comes with one condition, Julian added, his eyes serious. That you never stop playing for yourself, even when the world wants you to play for them. I fell in love with your music when you thought no one was listening. I've fallen in love with you watching you stay true to that authenticity, despite everything. The word love hung between them, spoken now. For the first time, Nora looked down at the tiny violin in her hand, then back at Julian. There would be 2 conditions, she said softly. The second being that you remember the lesson of the shelter, that sometimes you need to listen before solving. Julian's smile was answer enough. I'm learning. 6 months later, the headline in the arts section of the New York Times read, Virtuoso in the Classroom, How Nora Winters and the Reed Arts Initiative are Transforming Music Education. The accompanying photo showed Nora teaching violin to a group of elementary school students, her face alight with purpose. Julian appeared in just one small photo, watching from the back of the classroom, his expression one of quiet pride. The article mentioned their relationship in a single line. Winters, whose partnership with tech philanthropist Julian Reed extends beyond the professional, brings both classical training and street performance experience to her revolutionary curriculum. That evening, Nora played at the shelter's newly renovated community space, a project she and Denise had designed, and Julian had funded, with the stipulation that it be named after Nora's father. Julian sat among the residents, no different from anyone else, his attention fully on the music as Nora performed, not Mendelssohn or Bach, but an original composition. She had titled it Recognition, a piece that began with a single violin voice, seemingly isolated before being joined by harmonies. That didn't overpower but complemented, creating something more beautiful than either could produce alone. When she finished, the applause was genuine, not because of who she knew or what she represented, but simply because her music touched something true in everyone who heard it. Later, as they walked home through streets where they were sometimes recognized, but increasingly often allowed their privacy, Nora thought about how far they'd both come from that chance encounter in the park 13 years ago. What are you thinking about? Julian asked, his hand warm around hers. That sometimes the notes we play without knowing who's listening end up being the most important music of our lives, she replied. Julian stopped walking, turning to her with an expression of such open affection that no wealth or fame could compare to its value. In that case, he said, I'm very glad I was listening. And in a city that had once overlooked them, both him in his moment of despair, her in her years of struggle, they continued writing their melody together, no longer invisible, but seen for exactly who they were,